Okay, so today's class number 5, we are going to start out by talking about the new forms that just came out. So the day that we did this class last Tuesday, we talked about the subject to sale of the buyer's property. And I don't know if you guys remember that we're on the training that day. It was really kind of confusing. I tried to explain it the best I could, but after I got done and we got done with the class, I was still even going, oh my gosh, this is just nuts. I feel like I tried to explain it, but then it really didn't make a whole lot of sense even to me. And so ironically, I think it was the very next day on Wednesday, we got notice from the UAR that they had came out with new forms, and that happened to be one of the new forms that they made a change to. So I'm thrilled. But with that being said, now I want to go back over the new forms with you since we went over the old ones, and so that you are up to date on what's going on if you haven't had a chance to look at them. So when we talked about the sale of the buyer's property, this was the old form that they were using. This is the one we went over. And if you remember, we talked about all of the different times that on here where there was deadlines and things where in this section here, it talks about if the third party contract is canceled and you're under contract already, you have to notify the seller within 4 days. And then if you do not currently have, if you didn't have a offer on the home already, you only had to tell a certain day to get under contract. That settlement deadline had to be no later than 4 days prior to settlement and all those things. So the nice thing is the new form is so much more simple and it's not so wordy. And so it actually helps your buyers a ton. So, and it helps you to not have to worry about certain dates and deadlines and things like that. So this is the new form. So make sure that if you have your packets together or you've been keeping track of any of this, that you pull out the old ones. They are on the MLS for the Wasatch Front MLS. I'm assuming they will be for the rest of the state as well on your websites as well. But subject to the sale of the buyer's property, this is the new addendum that you'll want to use. So when you go in to pull up the forms and look at them, it will say, it'll have an update and a date on there, and you'll notice that's a red tag on it. And that's the one, they took the other one out. So you'll notice that that is the new form. So the difference is that it's much more simple, like I said. So subject to the sale, you're just basically going to put down the property location of the property and that it is subject to the sale of the buyer's property. And there's A. So A is the buyer's right to cancel before the due diligence deadline and financing and appraising deadline, whichever is later. So the two things that will make a difference here is, number one, if your buyer cancels the contract before the due diligence deadline or the finance and appraisal deadline, whichever's later, then they will get their earnest money back. So keep that in mind. It used to be that they had a way out no matter what because it was subject to the sale of their home. Now the buyer has a right to cancel after the due diligence deadline or the financing deadline. But if they, so on here it says if the buyer does not cancel the RIPSI by that deadline, whichever's later, and has not closed on the sale of the buyer's property, the buyer may cancel the RIPSI on or prior to the settlement deadline by providing written notice. So you have to give written notice upon where the earnest money shall be released to the seller. So that is new. So keep that in mind if you use this new form, that you want to make sure that you're watching the dates really closely for your buyers. They can't pull out just because they didn't sell their home if they get past all of their deadlines, except for settlement. So, and of course the seller agrees that if that happens, they get it, that the earnest money is remedy for any liquidated damages. So another thing to think about is, I know a lot of agents are really having a tough time with earnest money. They're trying to get the earnest money higher so that they have a better offer. And when you have a subject to sale of the buyer's property, obviously you're kind of already not the best offer coming in probably. So I noticed that a lot of agents are raising the earnest money to like $5,000 or $10,000 so it looks better. Problem is now if they have a home to sell and they don't sell it and you don't withdraw, they're going to lose that full earnest money. So keep that in mind. You don't want that to happen to your buyer. Okay, so on the second part of this form, it also talks about the listing requirement, which This is awesome, because when you're talking to your buyers and they're wanting to make offers on homes, but they haven't listed their home yet, and they're kind of like on the fence about for sale by owner, or we're not sure what we're going to do. This basically tells them, the seller, is it listed or is it not listed? And if it's not, then it has to be listed within 7 days of acceptance of this contract. So, and they also have to put the name of the listing agent and who the brokerage will be. So it kind of pushes them into getting off the fence and not just testing the market. So that will hopefully push these buyers to move forward with the seller of their homes and not put it off. I've had quite a few agents from my office that have called me in the past couple of months that have said that they've had properties that were under contract and it was subject to the sale, and the buyer was like dragging their feet on getting their house listed because they were afraid it was going to sell too fast. But then what was happening is they didn't end up putting it on the market, and then, you know, a few days before settlement or whatever, they changed their mind for some reason or another, and they didn't even end up listing the home. And that listing agent, you know, was upset. The buyer's agent, who should have probably been the listing agent, I would assume, not always, but you would hope, put all that time and energy into that, and then the buyer never even bought the home, you know, after all. So and then it just does say on here, buyer's property contract status. It just says what the status is. It doesn't have to say what the dates are. It doesn't have to say, you know, what date it went under contract, any of that. So this form is much better. It's actually a lot better for the buyer. And it's not so confusing, thank goodness. Any questions on the new form as far as that goes? All right. Okay, so I wanted to bring up then a lot of agents that haven't worked with the other side, where you've got the listing, and or say maybe you're never worked with the buyer where they put an offer in and it was subject to the seller of their home. The seller comes back and gives an addendum that says, okay, this is our option. We're going to be able to keep our home on the market with a time clause. If you've never used a time clause, basically what it is it is the buyer and seller agreeing that the seller can continue to offer the property for sale on the MLS and accept any backup offers. And then at the seller's discretion, they may notify the buyer in writing of an accepted backup offer. So what that means is, let me go back. Sorry, I thought I had more on there. What that means is basically if they decide they want to write in, or if they want to receive, they take another offer, they want to accept that offer. And in the time clause, the seller has said, you know what, we're going to give the buyer 48 hours. If we do get another offer, they'll have 48 hours to remove any contingencies. And if they don't, then they can go ahead and put this other offer in first position and the first buyer is out. So a lot of times when I've talked about these forms, a lot of people didn't even know about the option to keep the property on the market time clause addendum. So I put it on here so that you're aware. So if you see that come over from the seller's agent, or you are the seller's agent and you want to make sure that you give your seller every possible opportunity to get other offers to come in, you want to make sure that you use this addendum and counter back if you have to the buyer, if the seller is going to keep their house on the market. And right now it's not a bad idea, just because there's not that many homes on the market. There's tons of buyers. Sometimes buyers are offering way higher than what appraisals are coming in. You're just running into all kinds of things. So it would be nice to be able to take those backup offers. So in that case, if you do have a buyer and seller that are under contract and the seller does have the time clause, there is a new form in there as well that is the buyer's notice to the seller of removal of conditions, which is the time clause notice. That's a brand new form. So what it is say for instance, the buyer has their home, it's on the market, they finally got an offer on it and they go ahead and close on it, or their lender gives them the okay to say, hey, you know what, you don't even need to sell your home anymore in order to qualify, so you can remove that, the time clause, the condition. Then what it is the buyer now can give the seller notice to say, okay, we're going to go ahead and remove our contingency as far as the addendum number, whichever happens to be, the option to keep the house on the time clause or on the market time clause addendum. Basically what that is that it tells the seller that now they're removing that contingency, and so the seller is no longer able to accept other offers and bump them out, basically. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions on that part? I know there's a lot of information on here, but I try to go through each of these forms just to make sure that you know where that they're in there, because we don't use them very much, but I want you to be aware that they are there.
Can you, this is Vaughn, can you kind of summarize that whole process without talking about forms? You represent, the buyer's agent or the seller's agent when they get those offers, and what the options that we have are.
Okay, so let's start out first of all to say that you have the listing on the home, and the buyer sends over an offer to you, and you're going over it with your clients. So you're sitting down, you're with your sellers, and you're saying, listen, these people have made a really strong offer. They've got X amount of dollars for their earnest money, but they do have a home to sell. So they will have sent over this subject to sell a buyer's property addendum with it. What you could do is, it would be a good idea to explain to your sellers at that time, if they're really kind of going back and forth deciding which offers they want to take, which ones are better, or whatever. Of course, earnest money is always a big deal, and how much they're putting down is a big deal, and all those things. But so basically you just want to make sure that you understand that with that seller, you're explaining to them how the subject to the sale of their home, of the buyer's home, works. They'll be interested to know that they can keep earnest money now. We don't want to create a big, huge problem. We don't want to push that issue to where that's all they think about. However, it is better now that they can't just walk away at the end without losing their earnest money. However, if you do have your seller and you're explaining to them that you've got this offer, it's subject to the sale of the buyer's property, what you would want to probably recommend to your seller is that they do the option to keep the property on the market time clause, which would be this addendum. So if everything looks good on the REPC, and even you're willing to go, along with the option for them to sell their home, that condition, you would still just do a counter offer to put in the option to keep the property on the market time clause. So that's where that would fall into place. So that's the seller's option. So once the buyer comes back and say they accept that and they say that's fine, we'll do that. Of course, the seller at that point has the option. They can just keep on marketing the property. If they do get another property or another buyer that they want to accept an offer on, they have to give notice to the buyer, and it has to be whatever time frame they had agreed upon on this option. So a lot of times it's 48 hours or 72 hours. It just really depends on what you guys decide, what they decide the buyer and seller agree to. So that's where that comes into play. And then, of course, if the buyer then decides they're going to go ahead and remove their condition for any reason, say they had their home, they put it on the market, it went under contract quickly, they closed on it already, and they went to the closing table. Now that's not an issue anymore. They've got their funds. Then they would give the notice to the seller. Right now, we don't have a lot of time span where that happens a lot, because everything happens so quickly that we usually wouldn't have time that the buyer got their house on the market, got it sold, and then all of a sudden, we've got another month and a half before we're going to close on this home. Things are moving much quicker now, but when we get back into a market where it stays regularly, where it takes 2 to 3 months to get a house under contract and closed, that's typically when you probably see more of these removal of conditions come in. Then you would, of course, send that over, and basically that stops that seller from being able to accept any other offers and bump them out at that point.
Thank you. So if I'm representing the buyer and we find a home, we put our offer in pending the sale of our home, we get our home, let's say we're going to be the listing agent for our buyer's home, and we get it on the market, but they have given us this time contract, this time thing, time clause for, let's say, 72 hours, so 3 days. So at the end of the 3 days, if I don't remove I need to sell our home as a condition, then it goes to the next person.
Yes.
Or it goes to assuming they have it's the time starts when they get an offer, isn't it?
The
A
time
secondary offer?
it starts from the time that the seller sends notice to the buyer.
Okay, that they have another offer.
Yes. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's kind of where that time frame starts. And that also can, I mean, that could even be something that could be negotiated when you're doing I'm going to try to go back here so I can get to the right form for you. The option to keep property, property on the market. That can even be, there's more to this obviously than just what I'm showing on you, this screen right now. I just wanted you to be aware that that is there. But if it was to go through that, you can see where there's, it talks about how many hours or days or, whatever it is after they've been notified.
So let's just say the buyer
Mm-hmm.
that is under contract and they agreed to the time clause. We put the home on the market for the buyer. Another offer comes in on the house, the original house, and now the clock starts for 72 hours. But if I don't, if I cancel that time clause or cancel the requirement that my home has to be sold, my buyer, I can say, hey, listen, we still have due diligence. We still actually have until financing, because they probably won't qualify for the loan at the financing deadline. So they could waive the requirement to stay under contract and then take it up to the appraisal or the finance day, right?
No, not necessarily, because I don't know if you guys can see this on the screen, I just pulled it up here. So this is the option to keep the property on the market clause. So you can see on here that number one, the option is the right to accept other offers. So I'm just going to read it so that you guys can, because it's probably hard to see it on here. It's not very big. Buyer and seller agree that seller may continue to offer the property for sale and to accept any backup offer. Seller, in seller's sole discretion, may notify buyer in writing of an accepted backup offer. Buyer's right to remove condition. If seller does provide written notice to the buyer, then buyer shall have blank amount of days after receipt of seller's written notice to provide written notice to seller of buyer's removal of the following conditions from the REPC. So there are on here, there's due diligence, there's appraisal and condition financing, if applicable, subject to the sale of the buyer's property condition. So when they're putting this and you're doing a counter offer back to the buyer when they want to keep their house, but they want to list their home and have the option to sell it. When you do this, if you were the seller's agent, you would want to check on here all of those. If it was right at the very beginning, you may want to say if it's financing and if applicable, obviously the third one down says subject to the sale of the buyer's property condition. If they basically if they say they're going to remove it, then they have to basically prove that they can close, that they're able to close on the home without the sale of that property.
Okay, but if it checks all three, then I've basically waived my right to due diligence. I've given a green light on this thing if I waive my due diligence condition.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying is
that would not be good.
This is for the seller's agent that would be checking these boxes. Well, so yes, if it came back and they countered this to you as a buyer's agent and it had due diligence and appraisal and all those things, and you don't agree with that, you would counter back and remove the due diligence and the appraisal condition. But financing, and if applicable, the subject to the sale of the buyer's property condition, it would have to be, you would want to check that one for sure if you were representing the seller. There could be other reasons, because this isn't just, it is the option to keep the house on the market, but it can be due to their due diligence too. So if you wanted to, let's say you got an offer from a buyer and it's not subject to the sale of their home, but the buyer or the seller says, we want to continue to market our home, If we get a better offer before you finish your due diligence and you don't finish it and say you're done with it, we can accept this other offer. So it doesn't just have to be only if somebody has a house to sell. You can use this for any of those reasons. Appraisal, due diligence. I don't know if, why you would, but I mean, I guess you could. Does that make sense?
Not exactly. I'll have to digest that a little bit more because I feel like this is putting my buyer at risk if I waive all those conditions that are standard.
Yeah, and it would. You wouldn't want to agree to that if you're representing the buyer. The only time this would probably come into play that I can see is, say for instance, you had a seller that has marked their property down because it's basically as is. And they're saying, we marked the price down because we know it needs work. And your buyer comes back and says, yeah, but we want to make sure we have our due diligence. They could say that's fine, but we're going to go ahead and keep marketing the home. And if we do get another offer on the home, we're going to give you 72 hours to remove your contingency of the due diligence. And if you don't, then we can go ahead and accept that other offer. So what it could do is it could stop somebody from keeping somebody's house on the market for 4 weeks, 3 weeks, or whatever it happens to be. It pulls them off the market. So say you've got a house that's a hot item and you've got 10 people wanting it at the same time. It's a great deal. And you've got, somebody pushing dates way out there, 3 to 4 weeks. Then yeah, I mean, the seller has the right to come back and say that. You don't have to, as the buyer's agent, agree to it.
Okay. I'll read this several times and see what it seems like it's lopsided.
Yeah, well, it's removal of conditions. It's not just removal of the buyer's home selling. These are other conditions that could be on too, such as the appraisal. So let's say, for instance, maybe you've got a cash buyer that comes in and says that they're going to pay cash. But they do say, we're going to pay cash, so we're not getting financing, but we do want to make sure we're going to get an appraisal done on the house. And if the appraisal doesn't come in at least to what we're offering, then, we're not going to buy the house. That could be one of the conditions. So
that's already in there. That's already part of the REPC.
Only if they check that it's part of the REPC, if they say
Right.
it's subject to the appraisal. That's what I'm saying.
So this is your thing to uncheck those boxes. This is an addendum to uncheck those due diligence, appraisal, and financing boxes that were checked on the original REPC.
Yeah, if you wanted to keep the house on the market and continue to accept other offers, right now you can accept backup offers, right? You can backup offer, and if something fails, then you can move that backup offer into first position.
Right.
This gives you the chance to say, okay, well, you're in first position, but if we get another offer on the home that's better or something we want to take that doesn't have all these conditions, if we want to accept it, we're going to give you written notice and you will only have 72 hours to remove your conditions. So they can say, which conditions is it that you want them to remove? Well, we want them to remove the due diligence, or we want them to remove the appraisal, or all three. So financing can be financing, or it can be subject to the sale of the buyer's home condition.
Okay. Thank you. You've clarified that. Thank you.
Okay, good. Sorry. I know it's so wordy, and sometimes I'm like, oh, I just wish that they wouldn't. Sometimes they put so much verbiage in there that it just doesn't even make any sense to anybody. It would just be more, practical to just make it very small.
So if they didn't remove these, can you just remove the subject of sales?
Yes.
Subject of sales property without removing the financing?
Well, financing is normally, I mean, I guess if they can get something from the lender showing that they're approved without selling the home.
If someone's moving up in the world and they're selling their $300,000 house to you to buy a $500,000 house and taking their equity as their 20% down payment to get the terms that they want, but their $300,000 house doesn't sell for $300,000, it sells for $280,000. And so now they don't have that $20,000 in equity to get them up to the 20%. So now they're at 15%. and their terms aren't as good because it's not a prime loan. And so they would still maybe be able to, I would hope they'd be able to back out of the, I'd want to protect my buyer in case the home doesn't sell for what they need it to sell for, to be able to still back out based on financing, because now they're less than 20% down. You know what I mean? I mean,
Yeah.
because
Well,
you can back out for any reason on the financing.
and if you wanted to really clarify the difference of which one, and this came back and the seller gave this to you for the buyer, you could always counter back and say that under, you know, we're countering option number one, we will remove the subject to the sale of the buyer's conditions. However, financing will remain, you know, as of X date or whatever.
Okay. All right. Just an addendum to the addendum. All right.
Yeah. So if you always just make sure you're spelling out exactly what it is that your buyer or seller want, even if it's not professionally done, as long as it makes sense and you're referring to what it's talking about. So when you're talking about this addendum, you would want to say, you know, according to addendum number 3, option to keep property on the market. They've kind of, in my opinion, this is my opinion, but they've made this look like it's only for option to keep your home on the market with a time clause if somebody has a home to sell, but it's really not. It's for any of these things. And by not checking, like what you're saying, if they have financing, they should have financing box by itself, and then they should have a box under that that says subject to the sale of the buyer's property. It should be a whole separate thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Since it don't, I would just counter that back.
Okay, thanks. And you're right. It doesn't say, you know, this is for subject to sale of the property addendum. This is just to put a time clause on whatever conditions.
Yeah. And I think that that's kind of, depending on how long you've been in the business, when somebody says time clause, you usually automatically will go right to thinking, well, they have a home to sell.
Yeah,
And it's
right.
not.
Well,
This is more
typically, yeah.
that. Yeah. So yeah, it's just kind of been there for a long time. So it's hard to wrap your mind around it. So
Sorry, everyone, for my long question.
you know what, you're fine, really. I would rather that we stopped and talk about it so everyone understands, because some, you know, not everybody wants to speak out and ask if they don't get it, because they feel like they're, oh gosh, I'm not going to ask, you know. But I would rather we did and we stopped and went over it than you guys to leave going, oh my gosh, I have no idea what she's talking about. So, okay, so also I want to point out on here on C, just underneath this option to keep the house on the market time clause. This is, I think, what's throwing me off. When you look here, number 1, option to keep house on market time clause, they can keep it on the market. Then they do have all the conditions that they can go through. Just make sure that the buyer shall have, make sure the days and or whatever you happen to put right there, that's so many days after receipt of the seller's written notice. And then below that, it says on C, additional earnest money. Then they could say, in addition to removing the above check conditions, buyer agrees to deposit an additional earnest money amount in the amount of, and I don't know why it doesn't have a line there, unless you type something in there. That's kind of something they need to fix, I think. And then buyer shall deposit the additional earnest money into the same location as the earnest money within 4 calendar days. And then D says buyer's right to not remove conditions. If the buyer does not remove from the REPC the above check conditions within the time specified in section 1B of this addendum, then the REPC will automatically become canceled, in which instance the earnest money deposits shall be released to the buyer. So just, you know, I just wanted to point all these out. I know it's a lot to digest, but at least you kind of have an idea now what's there. And what when we're talking about these, the reason I put these forms in here as we're going through the REPC is because it kind of, to me, makes a little more sense of each section we go through, what it is that goes with that. So that is the new form, is the subject to the buyer's property selling. So that one is actually better. And then again, like I said, the buyer's notice to the seller to remove the conditions. If they decide they want to do that, they could anyway. So I guess the reason that you would usually use this form is if you do have the seller given notice. that the buyer needs to remove their conditions, this would be the form that you would want to do that with. You wouldn't want to just send writing over in like an email or something. So that would be your written notice. Okay, is that, everyone got that? I'm glad, yeah. So, sorry, I'm reading chats. Yeah, people are saying I'm glad that you asked the questions. Oh, yes, I am too. Okay, so another area that's kind of a little bit of a gray area for people when they're going over a Rep C is prorations and assessments and other payment obligations. You know, there's so much to go through, and so I really highly recommend that even after you go through these and stuff, I mean, if I go line by line, we're going to be, I mean, this class will go for like, you know, 25 classes or something. But what I really recommend is that you read through them, print everything out so that you have it in front of you, make your highlights, do whatever you have to do to get to know these forms really, really well. But what I really want to point out is kind of the main things that we have seen problems with in the past. And so that's why I want to make sure when we're looking at these, that the highlighted areas, not that they're the most important, but they're the things that it seems like most people have the biggest issues with. But all the prorations, including to, but not limited to, of course, is the homeowners association dues, property taxes for the current year, which we all know property tax in Utah it's collected it's in arrears. And so everything that's being collected in November this year was for last year. It was all, you know, it's all of the last year. So they assess it based on now and say, this is what's due, but it's really for the whole past year. It's not for the coming year. And so if you're, depending on what time of year you're closing on the home, you may not know what the new taxes are going to be yet. And so your buyer's payment could go up a little bit if that was the case. And then rents, if there's any rentals on the property, say that they've been renting out the home for some time and they've got a renter in there, all the prorations will be done based off of that. And of course on here, so the part that I have 4.2, the special assessments, I want you to know on here that any assessments for capital improvements is approved for the homeowners association. So like homeowners associations sometimes have clubhouses and they say, you know, we're going to repair or we're going to re-shingle the roof or something like that, or we're going to redo the pool or things like that. If it was assessed during the time that the seller was in the home and it was supposed to be paid by them, that's something you'd want to know about so that you can make sure that when you're checking on here, that it's going to be paid by the seller. If it's something that has to be split equally, because that's what they say in, you know, their CC&Rs and their HOA, everything, you know, happens to say that, you would need to know that. So it's really a good idea when, especially if you have a listing, if you have a listing that you put on the MLS, I would definitely, if you've got the HOA information and you've got all of the CC&Rs and meeting minutes and all those kind of things, upload whatever you have into the documents on the MLS so that the buyer's agents are able to get in there faster and get that information. When you're representing the buyer, it's really frustrating when you've got the seller's disclosure deadline is supposed to be in 4 or 5 days and you're expecting them to get you all this information and they haven't even started working on it yet. You're probably not being realistic if you're not only giving the sellers, you know, 5 or 6 days to get together all this information when they have CC&Rs and HOAs and maybe water rights, you know, title reports, all of those kind of things. So if you're not sure and you haven't reviewed it, if you represent the buyer, you obviously want to check that the seller is going to pay for that. If you're representing the listing side, you want to check that and see what's been checked to make sure that your seller is not going to get hit with something huge that they hadn't planned on. So that's a good time to be looking through seller disclosures before you even put the house on the market or you send it over to a buyer's agent, to make sure that if there's something checked on there that you need to be aware of, that you talk about it prior to, not after it's already been accepted. Assessments with special improvement districts that might come up. Special improvement districts could be fire, it could be sewer, it can be all kinds of things. And then of course down here you've got escrow fees. Of course, if there's anything that's agreed to in writing that either one's going to be paying for fees, You want to make sure that they're collecting that at closing and either crediting it to the buyer or it's being held to pay for whatever it happens to be that might be coming up. A big thing that I've noticed that's been a real issue in the past has been rental deposits and prepaid rent. I've seen where landlords that own the home, excuse me, decide to sell a property and they've collected either upfront rent for 2 or 3 months, somebody paid ahead, or they've got all their security deposits and everything that are in cleaning deposits that they prepaid. I've watched and seen this happen before where they never transferred it over to the new owner and the owner was stuck with the lease that was already in place. So maybe you've got a 6 months left on that lease. You have to accept it that way. So if you have a property and it's got a 6 month or a year lease on it, and there's a renter in there, they're going to be in there for a year. You're accepting that property. So you need to make sure that if it is a rental property, that your buyer's getting a copy of all of the lease agreements, that you're getting copies of all the security deposits and all the accounting and everything like that. It can get pretty in-depth. So if you're not sure on that, make sure you check with your broker and find out exactly what needs to be done. There can be long-term leases and there can be short-term rental bookings. If they don't expire prior to closing, they shall be paid or credited by the seller to the buyer at settlement. So again, just make sure that if somebody has paid their deposits and somebody's renting, make sure that your buyer is getting that credit from the seller, because when the buyer moves out, they have to refund that back if, according to the lease, they follow through with everything they were supposed to do. Any questions on rentals? Nope. Okay. Well, if you think of something, just interrupt me. Okay, so HOA and other entity fees charged upon change of ownership. A lot of the HOAs now are charging a transfer fee. So if you have an HOA and they're going to charge a transfer fee, they call them all kinds of different things: community enhancement fees, HOA reinvestment fees. Basically, it's a change of ownership fee. A lot of times that will be charged to the buyer upon them moving in. But if that's something your buyer says, no, I'm not paying that as part of my negotiations, I want the seller to pay it, just make sure what's ever being checked here is appropriate. And if you're representing the seller and the buyer's supposed to pay this and you're not reading this area, and it says the seller's going to pay for it, and you don't explain that to your seller, they're going to be pretty upset if it's a pretty hefty fee that they're going to have to pay and they've agreed to it. All right, boring stuff I know, but stuff that you really need to know about. And the reason I point it out so much is because it gets overlooked a lot. Okay, so utility services, the buyer agrees to be responsible for all utilities and other services provided to the property after the settlement deadline. The provisions of this section shall survive closing, which just means that just because it closed doesn't mean that that's not still the fact, that they still have to make sure that that's their responsibility is to make sure all the utilities are switched and paid for. Sales proceeds withholding, of course, this is just stating that the escrow officer closing office is authorized and directed to withhold from the seller's proceeds at closing any sufficient funds to pay off their mortgages, trustees, judgments, mechanics liens, tax liens, things like that. So confirmation of agency. So I know this seems very simple, and it's like, well, this agent represents this seller and I represent this buyer, and that's fine. If that's the case and you're from different companies, then it's not a big deal. That's exactly how it should be. However, if you are representing seller or buyer or both, but no matter what, it's even if there's two agents in the same company, they're still represented under the same brokerage, so it's still limited agent. So if that's the case, then you would need to put both buyer and seller as limited agents. But prior to even getting to this section, when you're writing out that offer, you need to make sure you have your limited agency consent agreement that's filled out, and it has to be done prior to you doing the REPC.
Question.
So,
I throw agents from different offices. So one from your office, one from Salt Lake. Is that limited agency still?
It is.
So yeah. It's just company, same company, no matter who the broker is.
Yep.
Your
yep.
office.
Yes.
Okay.
Caldwell Banker, same thing. Any of the companies. Now, like Century 21s, there are some that they're individually owned. And so, like Century 21 Gage Farrar and Associates versus Century 21 Everest Group or something. Those are two different companies. So that would not be a limited agency. Basically, I should say it's under one principal broker, and Bill is the principal broker under all of our company. So we would be limited agent on that situation. So agent in St. George office represents buyer, agent in Clearfield office represents seller. We're still considered limited agency because it's within the same company. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Principal broker.
Sure. Okay, so again, make sure that when you are going through this, that you should be, before you even write up an offer, before you even start to negotiate, if that's the case, you need to always make them aware. So obviously, if you're an agent in the St. George office and we got an agent in our Clearfield office, we know that it's a limited agency situation just because of the fact that it's under the same company. So that would be what they call in-house sell. Okay, so even if you're in-house sell, they're still involving the seller and the buyer in the same brokerage. So it's a little different in the fact that, you're representing the buyer over here and the seller over here, and you're negotiating for them the best you possibly can as agents. But we still have to make them aware that it's just not the same as if they were with a different company. So, but it does say on here as well that if they're both represented by one or more agents in the same brokerage, it's commonly referred to an in-house, and consequently, most in-house sales involve limited agency because the seller and buyer are represented in the same brokerage. We want them to know that we're still going to be honest and we're going to treat everybody, the same as we normally would. The difference is that we do have a little bit less weakening and bargaining position when you've got, if you've got one agent representing buyer and seller. It's a lot different than it is when you've got two different agents. But we still have to let them know either way. Okay, so title and title insurance. Of course, we all know that everything goes through the title company. So as far as the property goes, they have, oh, sorry, I've got agents keep calling me. I need to move my phone away. We all know that whenever you get a property under contract, that you want to send it in as quickly as possible to get the title insurance done on the property. Make sure that it can be covered, make sure there's nothing on there that the seller doesn't know about, maybe a judgment or a lien or something they didn't know about that they wouldn't be able to pay off with the amount that they have in there as far as their equity goes. But the main thing is you want to make sure too that there's no judgments for the buyer, something that's pulling up with the buyer that something could go against them. One thing I want to mention, and this is kind of off a little bit from what we're talking here. If you're representing, say, husband and wife or two partners, and they have talked about joint tenancy, or you've talked with them about joint tenancy, if you're not sure what that is, I suggest that you talk with your title company and have them explain the differences to you. I'll make it very simple if you're not sure. Joint tenancy means that it can be two people. It doesn't have to be a husband and wife. It can actually be more, I believe, more than two. But joint tenancy difference between that and the other ones is all that if something happens to one of the owners of the property that's on the deed, it will automatically transfer to the other person. It doesn't have to go to probate or anything like that. So for instance, I just had a closing last week, and the loan was under the husband's name. The wife was not on there because of credit issues. Well, I shouldn't say credit issues. She didn't have any income really, and so they weren't using her on there, and her credit score was a little bit lower, so they left her off, and he was going VA. So when we got done signing, I asked them, I said, listen, I don't know if you're aware or not, but typically people like to be on their joint. If something happens to one or the other person, then the property automatically will transfer over. You don't have to go in and try to go through probate and try to get them to change all that. Even if you have a will, that won't do it. And so we were talking about that, and they were really interested and said, yeah, absolutely, that's what we want to do. So when I talked to the escrow officer, I told her, I said, listen, they want to do joint tenancy. So as soon as we get done, can you, do the basically it's a quick claim deed that goes from him only to both of them, puts her on the deed with him. And she mentioned and said, yes, I'll be happy to do that. It's $45 for the recording fee or something like that. But the one thing that I mentioned to him that we were talking about is I said, I'm not going to try to get into your personal business. However, something that I had heard before in title had told me is that if the buyer, if the person that's going to be added to that loan, or I'm sorry, to the deed, if they've got maybe a judgment against them, or maybe they've been in an accident and they've got something out there that hasn't been completed yet, where maybe they could come back and put a lien against the home because her name's on it now. It's just something to think about, that they might want to consider at that time if that's an issue. And so, we talked about it and that was fine with them. But the point is, if you've got two people buying it together and that's their intention and they want to be on there so that it passes to one or the other, if something happens to the other person, definitely suggest that so that they understand what it is, and let the title company, they can explain to them the differences as well. So that was kind of off of this a little bit, but I did want to mention that to you. So long-term lease and rental agreements, again, we just talked about that, but if you decide to accept an offer and it does have a long-term lease or rental agreement, basically longer than 30 days, then the buyer agrees to accept that, to not be able to move in. So if you've got a buyer that's buying a home and they want to be moving into it in 30 or 60 days and somebody's got a lease on it for the next 90 days, they have to accept it with that existing lease on it, and they can't make them move out. Okay, same thing. We talked about short-term rental bookings, title insurance. Again, basically, I'm just going to go through a couple of things here. As we go through seller disclosures, obviously that is part of the title insurance that you would send in to get a copy of that to make sure that everybody was clear on that.
Cindy,
yes.
On that long-term lease, that you still put the same settlement date that you would want. It just means the transfers. You become the owner at settlement, but you're going to be the people with the lease continue to live there. So you're not actually possession as in moving in, possession as in ownership.
Yes. Yes. Right. Yes. Great question. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. Yeah. So yeah, if you are closing on it, you're accepting it to say, okay, yeah, our possession of it is upon recording as far as it's ours that date. But if we have a lease and they don't move out for 60 days, then, we wouldn't be able to move in for 60 days. Something to also keep in mind too is just because there's a 60-day rental agreement doesn't mean they're going to move out. I've seen people that have that and accepted that, saying, well, that's okay, we'll let them finish out. They only got 30 days left. 30 days came along and all of a sudden they didn't make their payment and they didn't move out, and they had to go into a process of trying to evict them, and it took like 7 months for them to finally get possession of their home. And you can imagine it wasn't pretty, and it didn't look the same as it did when they first looked at the home. So that's something that a buyer needs to be aware of too.
So I've got a home under contract in Tooele. The people are supposed to be out on the 31st. The renters were closing on the 1st of September, or settlements 1st of September. If they don't move out, then what's the consequence to my seller if his renters have agreed to move out but then change their mind, they don't move out? That's a mess. I mean, but who pays for that mess? The seller or the buyer? Well,
the contract is between the buyer and the seller as far as the home goes and what they're buying. There's sadly, the contract isn't between the renter and you as the buyer at that time. It's still between the seller. So, I mean, I would imagine what would happen, and I don't want you to be freaked out because it probably won't happen, but, at that time, they would probably have to decide, are we going to go in and sign if these people aren't moved out yet? Or are we going to extend the closing date a week and make sure they move out? Either way, there's going to be some kind of legality there on somebody's part. And you would hope that people would just move out like they're supposed to. But that's why I mentioned it. It's something to keep in mind when, if somebody only has 30 days left or 15 days left or something like that, you're almost better off when you're writing up your offers to put the settlement deadline out 10 days, 15 days later than that time, just to make sure all those things come into play, and that really does happen. Because now you got the snowball effect where you're hoping that, you know, not only the seller comes in and signs and we get everything done, but that the people move out as well. So, and it's really hard to do your final walkthrough when people are still in the home.
Good point. Thank you.
Yeah. So I would just say at this point, you would, I mean, keep your fingers crossed, everything will go right. I'm sure it will. If not, then they will probably end up having to get an attorney involved to figure out where to go. I mean, honestly, I wouldn't even dare say, because I just, that's just not, that's way beyond my scope of practice. I'll tell you what I usually tell the clients. You'll have to get an attorney and ask them. So, and that's something we don't want to get too involved in either, you know, as far as giving advice on. We just want to make the buyers and the sellers aware of there are issues that can come up. And so I guess my real point of all this is, if you're reading through this with them and they understand when they're talking about the long-term lease and rental agreements, I think there's a lot of agents that never explain these sections at all. And so hopefully, if nothing else, it brings it back to that. If you ever come into a situation where you're working with a buyer, that's what they're looking at, that you can make sure that you're covering that in depth, if that's the case. Okay, so when we're talking about all of the seller disclosures, obviously there's a lot of things, and most of them are listed on this page, but there's also things that could not be listed on this page that you could, you know, specify as other. I didn't put these on here because I think you guys don't know what you're doing. I put it on here because there's probably some of the things that you haven't maybe even seen yet. And so the seller property condition disclosure, we've all seen that. We know what that is. However, please make sure that you are explaining to your sellers, even if they don't live in the home or they haven't lived in the home, they still need to fill it out. If it doesn't apply, they put NA next to it. If they don't know, they don't know, and they can write that they haven't lived in the home or whatever. But try to get them to fill it out as thoroughly as they possibly can, because it really protects them more than anyone. So, and it does say instructions to seller. If they give you kind of a hassle about it, they are obligated under law, regardless of occupancy, to disclose to the buyers the defects in the property and facts known to the seller that materially and adversely affect the use and value of the property that cannot be discovered by a reasonable inspection by an ordinary prudent buyer. That is basically, this is just for them to disclose their actual knowledge regarding the property, the condition of the property. And so you can see right under here where I've highlighted in red, it says complete the remainder of this form. Be specific when describing any past or present problems, malfunctions, or defects, location, nature of problem, etc. Use additional addendum if necessary. And if a question does not apply to the property, write NA next to the question. So as an agent, you cannot fill this out for your client, but you can look it over when they're done. And if they're missing items, definitely hand it back to them and say, listen, you missed this one. If it doesn't apply, just put NA or whatever. It's still up to you to try, you know, protect them and make sure they're filling things out and that the buyer can't come back later and say, well, yeah, but you left all this blank and whatever. Help them know that the more they fill it out, the more NA or no or yes or the explanation that they can give, the better. I always tell my sellers, you know what, if you don't tell them that something went wrong, your neighbors will. And that's one thing you don't want to happen. You don't want them to come back later. I see that a lot where people come back and, well, you didn't even, you know, they never said that there was a flood and blah, 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 you know, all these years ago. Well, they may not have lived in the home all the way back then, and they may not even have known themselves, but, you know, just tell them to be as honest as possible and tell what they know. One thing I do want to point out is that in the seller disclosures, there's the Foreign Investment in Real Estate, Real Property Tax Act. They call that FIRPTA. So if you are working with the listing or the buyer, either way, if your seller checks on here that they are a foreign person or entity, you need to make sure that you know that, and you need to make sure the buyer is aware, and you need to make sure that the escrow company is aware, because there's a tax that may have to be collected on this sale of the property. And if the seller doesn't, they don't collect it from the seller, the buyer could possibly be responsible for it. So when you are going through your seller disclosures with your seller, before you upload that to the MLS, please review it. Make sure if they checked yes on accident that they are a foreign person, clarify and get that fixed. If they are a foreign person or entity, then they can still sell the property. It has nothing to do with that. It's just that there's an income tax that would be withheld from a non-resident alien individual or corporation or partnership, trust, all these different things. Anyway, my point is make sure that no matter which side you're representing, that you are looking at this, that you're asking those questions. And when you have a listing agreement, it asks in there. And when you have a buyer broker agreement, it asks in there if they're a foreign person. So you should have plenty of places to look to confirm and clarify. Any questions on that? All right. Okay, so let me look here. I don't know how close we're getting. There's quite a few things on here. Obviously, you guys are aware of lead-based paint. Anything that was built prior to 1978 has to have a lead-based paint disclosure, and it also has to have a pamphlet. So if you are the listing agent and you're putting it on the MLS and it's required, it will tell you that you can't enter normally. It'll tell you that you have to upload the lead-based paint disclosure. That should be filled out when you do the listing, and you should have your seller fill it out, and you should be signing it and uploading it to the MLS, but you should also upload one of these pamphlets as well. And if you're not uploading it there, when you get somebody that is sending over an offer on a home that you have listed, you need to make sure that not only do you send over the lead-based paint disclosure to them for their buyer, you need to send over the pamphlet, because that's what it states in the form, is that you've done that. The reason I tell you that is because that is a way for a buyer to pull out down the road, or for a seller to say, you know what, this didn't happen, or this didn't happen. But typically it's usually for the buyer to have a reason to void the contract and not lose their earnest money when they know they're going to for another reason. If they find these loopholes, they will definitely look for it. So just make sure if you're representing the buyer, the same thing, you need to be giving them the pamphlet up front. You can download these. There's one on the MLS, and then I believe there's one also in the iPro library that you can download too. If you're not aware of what it is and people ask you, well, what's the big deal about it? These are the biggest issue is with children, pregnant women too, and adults, but mostly children. These are some of the issues that it can cause. And I know that my grandson and my son and daughter-in-law lived in a home. Their first home that they bought was built in like 1954. And their little boy was really small, and he was kind of acting funny and just didn't feel good, and having all kinds of problems. And they took him in, and his lead levels were really, really high. And so, they just watched it, and it came down. But basically what it was is they had been sanding and repainting in the home. And that's just from the dust and everything. It caused him, when they were playing and running around and things like that in the basement, it caused, some problems with him. So his lead levels were really high. So on your seller disclosures, acknowledgement, and certification, of course, this will be your disclosure. Make sure that whatever it is that your seller is giving you, if they do have information about lead-based paint that's been in the home, they've had a report done before, make sure if they're supplying that, you're checking the correct box for that in A. So if they do have, so basically A and B should match up. So I and I, or I and I should match up. So either they don't have any reports and they have no reports that they're providing to them. That would basically be the two that you would check. These are check boxes. And you can see on C and D, it says seller has attached the pamphlet to this document. Seller has reviewed the information about and certifies to the best of the seller's knowledge that it's accurate and true. So that's why I mentioned this to you, to make sure you upload that pamphlet. And if you're the buyer's agent and you're not providing this information to your buyer, same thing. If you're the listing agent, make sure you're signing here where it says agent and dating it. And then, go ahead.
So one thing about the lead disc on the lead paint, if you're selling a home and there's paint that's flaking inside or out, it's going to fail the VA or FHA appraisal.
Yeah.
Flat out going to fail. So you either need to put not FHA or VA available, or tell your sellers that they're going to have to fix it it's because the lead is now exposed and possibly exposed in the paint. So,
exactly.
So that's the danger, and you just need to know that, to not list it as available if it's paint is terrible.
Yeah, yeah, true. And I've seen that quite a few times where agents will put that it was FHA, VA, that they would accept that for their financing. And then you get there and you're like, this isn't even close. I mean, there's a million things wrong with this house. So yeah, that's a big deal. The house I just closed on last week, when we went through it, they were going VA. And I already know how hard the VA appraiser is to get out there anyway. And we didn't want them to have to come back again because they charge a lot of money to the seller. But so when we walked through it, I seen that there was a lot of peeling paint on the outside of around the garage doors. That's typically where you see it, around doors. But there was some on a railing and some other places too. And so I made the buyer aware that that was the situation. And between us and the seller's agent, we talked about it. And I said, I know that they are selling this home as is. They don't want to do any of the work because it's in a trust now and parents have passed on. But would you be okay if my buyers went over and, scraped and painted where the paint was peeling and stuff? And they were like, oh yeah, absolutely. And we didn't have one problem with the VA inspector or the appraiser coming out when he came out. They never said a word about it because they had fixed everything. So yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you. Okay, so again, just make sure that when you're the buyer's agent, again, it says that they've received copies of all the information as listed above. It also says again that the buyers received a pamphlet on the lead-based paint. So 2 times now it's in there. The seller has to provide it to them, and this is also saying that they've received it. So, and the buyer on this area, they have them initial the box here. That's not a check mark. That's the only place that they're going to initial. So they can choose one or the other. Okay. Any questions on it? They have 10 days, basically. If they decide they want to get a lead-based paint test, by the way, you can see here that if they initial that one, they have a 10-day opportunity to conduct the risk assessment to see if it's there, or they can waive that assessment. If they waive it right there and they want to come back later and they want to do it and you're still within due diligence, they can still do that, just so you know. Okay, so this is what a title commitment, this is first page of what it's going to look like. So if you're not really sure, whenever you get an offer on a home, whether you're the seller's agent or the buyer's agent, just send it into your title company. The seller's agent is responsible to send it in and get a copy over to you. That's part of the seller disclosures. If they don't, then make sure that you do that for your buyer and get it done as quickly as possible and have them review it. This is just a copy of some water rights that I put a copy on here just to, this is actually a recreational property that my son's buying. It's a cabin. But this was the water rights that came with that. And so I wanted you to see that this is similar to what that would look like. A lot of people aren't really sure. This is for a well. Of course, CC&Rs and bylaws. This is the same kind of thing. I know you can't really read it on there. I just want you to be aware that if there's CC&Rs, you should be getting copies of that. Typically, the title companies can get those for you if the seller's agent's not getting them for you right away, or the HOA is not getting it for you, or whatever it happens to be. But the bylaws for the HOA, again, same thing. They're on here. I just wanted to give you guys ideas of different things that you need to be aware of. Let me go back really quickly. Okay, so as you can see on here, we went over the property condition disclosures, the lead-based paint, title insurance, CC&Rs, HOA, budgets, minutes, all those kind of things. If you're listing a home, or the listings on there and they have that HOA information. If you're not aware of this, there is a form that is on the MLS that is for the HOA to request the documentation from them. So make sure that you're pulling that up. If you're working with the seller side, especially if you're going to list it, get that done right away and just, you know, send the paperwork over and get everything on its way, because people want to close much faster now than what they normally used to. Again, this would be the same place you would get those long-term and short-term lease agreements. So if you know it's a lease situation, make sure you're getting copies of all the leases from all the tenants that are involved, and let your buyer take a look at them. Of course, their booking schedules and everything. If there's any existing property management agreements in effect on the property, those remain in effect too. So if you've got a property management company that the seller has been working with, that they're having them collect rents and do all that, and they have an agreement for a certain amount of time, that agreement stays in place as well. So that's something your buyer would need to keep in mind, that they're going to have to pay out whatever that amount is monthly for their management fees. Water rights, we talked about that. Any claims or conditions known as far as environmental problems or building zone. So the property that I keep talking about that I just sold last week was on a ½ acre, and it used to be a family that owned all of the land. So when the mom and dad owned that home, they put up a little white picket fence across the back of the property, and evidently it was 1 foot onto their other property where the cornfield is. And so in the seller disclosures, we found out that that fence had to be moved in 1 foot or removed completely. That ended up kind of becoming an issue because we asked the seller to do it, and it was in the REPC on an addendum, and they said they were going to do it, and they didn't get it done. And so then the underwriter came back and would not even move forward with the loan until it was complete. Of course, we wanted to make sure it was done, so we just ended up having to remove the fence. But there was an agreement that had been put into place, but it was only for the buyer, for the people that lived there at the time and their family behind them. So that was actually part of the disclosure they had to give our test too. So there was quite a bit that we had to do. Same thing with water rights and water shares. If there's going to be shares of any kind, make sure you're getting documentation of what the water shares are. Make sure that they actually can pass on to a new purchaser of that property too. Again, here is on K, that's where we're talking about the foreign person. So on that form that we talked about, as far as the non-resident having to possibly collect a tax at closing, I want to show you, let me see here. I thought I put that on here. Oh, there it is. Okay. So here is the addendum for that. I didn't even know there was an addendum until just recently. So if you are the buyer's agent and you get the seller disclosures, which is a good idea to get prior to anyway, but you get the disclosures and now you find out that the seller is actually part of this situation with foreign investment, you need to have your buyer give the notice to the seller. So this would actually be an addendum or counter offer, depending on where you're at in the situation. Basically, what it is that it's notifying the seller that unless they provide the buyer with a certificate of exemption of a waiver within 14 days after acceptance, then the buyer will be instructed or tell the escrow or title company to keep X amount of dollars, or let them know that they need to withhold a certain required amount. And I don't know what the percentage is. I can't remember if it's 10% or something like that, but it's an IRS tax. And so,
10%.
Okay, I thought so. There's too many numbers flying around in my head. But yeah, it is. It's 10%. And so basically what happens is if they don't collect that, they could come back on the buyer for that. So you want to make sure that's why I say if you're not looking at your seller disclosures or you're not looking at your listing agreement to see if that's the case, and they're saying that they are actually a foreign investment property, whatever, just make sure that you know, because you want to protect your buyers and your sellers and everything. But that is an addendum, believe it or not, it's in there. So make sure you're using that if need be. Okay. So I think I've kind of went over. I usually keep it down to an hour. So what I think I'll do is I'm going to probably pull out this buyer's conditions and move that to class number 6. But what I wanted to mention most of all on this is that our third-party home inspection waiver, if your buyer decides they're not going to do a third-party home inspection on their home, they have that choice to do that. But iPro does require that you do fill this out. And if they're going to waive that, they need to be signing this no matter what. If they do get a home inspection, then they like to see a copy or something showing that they did the home inspection. So I just wanted to make sure that that waiver is required if they decide they're not going to do that. So any questions as far as any of this that we just talked about? It's a lot of information, I know, in a short time, but I'm doing all the talking, so. And you'll have to unmute yourself if you want to talk, sorry. Are we all good? All right, well, okay, then I guess we will just end it for today, and we'll have our next class next Tuesday. And in the meantime, if you guys have questions or whatever, you know, you're more than welcome to call me, call your broker, and then this class will, again, it'll be uploaded into the library within a few days. So if you missed some of it or you want to go back over it, you're welcome to. And if you find something that's a mistake, I try to keep up with everything, but if there's something that you see that you go, I don't know about that, please contact me and let me know so that I can look into it, so that I can clarify, make sure that I'm not telling you something wrong. So anyway, other than that, a checklist. I don't have a checklist. Do you mean a checklist, Jeremy, for like to make sure which forms you're turning in?
Yeah, just kind of a overview checklist for all of the information you need.
Stuff. We do have checklists in the library that you can go into. Yeah, and so if you go in there, that library's got a ton of stuff. I don't know if you guys have been in there or not, but if you go in there and you look, there's forms, and it'll say forms for buyers and sellers or transactions. It has that under both sides. There's really good stuff in there. Matter of fact, there's some really good material in there for just about everything you want. If you wanted to do a presentation for buyer or seller or go over any of these things, you can add it in there. But yeah, there's a lot of good information in there. So make sure you guys check it out.
Yeah, I'm getting ready to list a house, so I want to make sure I cover everything.
Yep, there is a checklist in there for both, for the sell side and the buy side. Yep.
Awesome.
All right, you guys. Well, thanks so much. I appreciate you joining me, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Have a good week.
Cindy. Thanks, Cindy.
You bet. Thanks.